Welcome back, learners. Let's look at the first concept, which is the Earth on the solar system. Now remember, we said that planet Earth is the third planet from our solar system, and it's the fifth largest planet on the solar system, and it is known as the only planet that can sustain life. Now let me teach you a simple way in which we remember the order of the planets. Now we can say, my very elderly mother just served us noodles. If you look at the abbreviation, you can see that planet Earth is on planet number 3 on our solar system. Now, if we remember our planets very well, we can name them. We can say that is M for Mercury, V for Venus, E for planet Earth, M for Mars, J for Jupiter, S for Saturn, U for Uranus, and N for Neptune. If you see that my very elderly mother just served us noodles is an easy way to remember the order of the planets. Okay, now let's move on with our content. Now, the Earth is made up of systems, and these systems, they are called spheres. The spheres then have to work together in order for life to exist on Earth. Okay, now how do these spheres work together? We have the land that has to interact with the water, that has to interact with the air in order for all living organisms to work together in order for life on Earth to exist and in order to form a system. Now that we looked at the Earth, let's move on to the second concept, which is the spheres of the Earth. We have 4 main spheres of the Earth. Namely, we have the atmosphere, which consists of the air. And remember, from our vocabulary, we said that the air is a mixture of gases. Here we find gases such as carbon dioxide. We also get oxygen. We get water vapor. Okay, water vapor. And then we also get nitrogen. Okay, so these are some of the gases that you find in the atmosphere. Excuse me, let me just erase that. This is an E, nitrogen. Okay, then we move on to the second sphere, which is our lithosphere. Our lithosphere consists of the land. On the land, this is where we find the soil, the rocks, all the stones that we find, as well as the sand, all the part of the land that consists of the lithosphere, as well as the sea floor, the one that you find deep down in the ocean, is also part of the lithosphere. Then we move on to the next sphere, which is the hydrosphere. The hydrosphere consists of the water that we find everywhere in the earth. In the lakes, we find the water in the lakes. We find the water in the oceans. We also find it in the rivers as well as dams. Okay, so if you look at the 3 spheres that I've just mentioned, which is the atmosphere, the lithosphere, as well as the hydrosphere, you can see that in my diagram, all these spheres are interacting with each other. So because they are interacting with each other, that's where we find the biosphere, which is the life on Earth. And the life on Earth consists of all living things. Okay, this we find all living things. This is where we find plants, animals, human beings, as well as microorganisms. We'll look at some of the spheres in more details as we go on. Okay. Now, let us see if you have understood the spheres of the Earth, and let us look at a little bit of an activity. Okay, here it says that label the spheres of the Earth. For the sake of our labeling, I'm going to name this first arrow A, and then I'm going to label the second one B, and the last one C. Okay, now let's look at number A. If you look at number A here, we have the clouds. And remember that in the atmosphere, we said that we have water vapor, and clouds are an example of water vapor. Then because of the clouds that are there, then we will say that point A is going to be our atmosphere. Please remember that the atmosphere consists of other gases such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. And these gases you cannot see with your naked eyes. Now let's move on to point number B. Point number B, as you can see there, you see some green there. That would mean that maybe there is some land there, okay? Where there is land, you know that you can associate land with the lithosphere. So point B, excuse me with that, point B would be our lithosphere. Okay, and when we look at point C, it's pointed there where we see some blue color there, and we know the blue color is associated with the water from the ocean. So where there is water, okay, this is our water. Where there is water, we can associate the water with the hydrosphere. Hydrosphere. Okay, if you can see from our labeling, we have labeled point A, point B, as well as point C. But there is one sphere that is missing. It is missing because we cannot see it in our diagram, but we know that in order for us to have what we call the biosphere, it's because of the interaction between the atmosphere, the lithosphere, and the hydrosphere. So these spheres need to interact with each other in order for the biosphere to exist. And remember, we said the biosphere is life, okay? It consists of life, and life is all living things such as plants and animals, okay? Now let's move on to our next slide. We are now going to look at the different slides when we look at the different spheres individually so that we can understand them in more details. So the first sphere we are going to look at is the atmosphere, okay? If you look at the atmosphere, we said that it consists of all the air above the surface of the earth, and we've already mentioned that the air is a mixture of gases such as carbon dioxide, oxygen, water vapor, as well as nitrogen. But here we are also saying about 79% of nitrogen is what consists of the air, and less than 21% of oxygen is also included in the air, and a small amount of carbon dioxide and other gases. So other gases here, we can say water vapor as well as carbon dioxide. They have a small percentage on the atmosphere, okay? Okay, learners, let's now go to our next sphere, which is our lithosphere. Now, the lithosphere consists of mainly the crust of the earth. If you remember the crust, this is where you and I walk on, which include of the soil, the sand. We walk on the soil, we walk on the sand, we walk also on mud, and that is part of the lithosphere. And we also sometimes go hiking on mountains, okay? Let me just erase here my naming so that you can see my mountain clearly. There is the mountain, which is also part of the lithosphere. And then we move on to say even minerals are also part of the lithosphere, as well as the seafloor. If you remember, I mentioned the seafloor previously. I said that the seafloor is part of the lithosphere because it is made up of sediments, of sands, as well as rock. So they are found deep inside the ocean. So the ocean floor there is called the seafloor, which is also part of the lithosphere. Okay, now learners, let's look at the hydrosphere, which includes all the water in the planet, including the ocean, the rivers, the groundwater, the rain, as well as the clouds. Now, the clouds form part of the hydrosphere because they consist of water vapor. Okay, I hope that is clear. And then we move on to the next point, which we are saying it's about 70% of the surface on Earth is covered in water, meaning that the water that is in the ocean, the water that is in the lakes, the water in the rivers, they all form part of that 70%. However, you will realize that even though we have the water in the ocean, we also have the fresh water that we find in the fresh water is where we find it here in the rivers. We find fresh water. We also find fresh water in the lakes, and we also find it in rain. That's where we find the fresh water. And then the ocean water is the water that is in the ocean. But the percentage of water, mostly of them, is form part of the ocean water. And only a small percent is the fresh water. Okay, now we move on to the last sphere, which is the biosphere. Now the word bio means life. That means here we are looking at all life on Earth, including all plants, all human beings, as well as animals. Right, you would see that here I've included terrestrial animals as well as aquatic animals. Now, what is the difference between the two is that terrestrial animals are all the animals that are found on land. This includes you and me, all the dogs, the cats, the cows. Those are some of the examples of terrestrial animals. And aquatic animals are all the animals that we find inside the water. Okay, all the animals that we find inside the water, and the animals that we find inside the water, they are more than, we have a lot of species that we find inside the water than the different species that we find in terrestrial. Okay, so that is what we talk about. When we talk about the biosphere, please do not forget also, excuse me there, I'm just making space for my next point. So if you look here, you realize that I did not include microorganisms. So please don't forget microorganisms. Microorganisms, they are also part of living things. These include bacteria, is an example of a microorganisms. These also include fungi, is an example of a microorganism, as well as protista. All these are examples of microorganisms. Remember, microorganisms are those organisms that you cannot see with your naked eyes. You will need to have a microscope in order for you to see them. Right, I've already explained that all life inside the oceans and under the soil, they all form part of the biosphere. I've already spoke about that. Most life on Earth exist inside the ocean because that's where we find different species. Learners, we'll take an air break and we'll come back shortly.